Hi, I'm Andrew Motlack, author of Drip, a Gothic Bromance, and I am here to read a selection. Overhead fluorescent lights cast a bluish pall over the waiting room. George thought of his high school cafeteria. Though not because of the lighting nor because of its size, this room was much smaller. The reason George felt the familiar knot in his stomach was that most of his and J.D.'s schoolmates were there. The ones who were not seated in plastic chairs, using tablets or going over resumes, were huddled in small groups, chatting boisterously and giving the windowless room an obnoxious energy. George found it unnerving to see classmates he had grown up with all dressed in suits and ties for the first time. It reminded him of a set of 19th century paintings of dog-headed gentlemen. He had seen them at the Middlestop Museum of Art before it was forced to sell off its collection. He turned to J.D., who was scanning the room, his eyes darting back and forth. "This is a cattle call. We're going to wind up wasting the entire day here for nothing." J.D. stopped scanning the room and stared straight ahead. Sheila Stilovich. George followed his gaze and saw the name on the Human Resources Manager's misaligned temporary door placard. Sheila Stilovich. George's stomach knot tightened, and he tensed as a wave of memories hit him. He was back there, trying once again not to drop his food tray as Sheila, with her braces and horse teeth and permanently crinkle-nosed smirk, stood 2 inches from his face and in front of the whole snickering room shouted, "Hi, Georgie, you gonna show me your tiny little dick? Show me your tiny little dick, Georgie. I know you got one." "Sheila," J.D. repeated, grinning. He pulled out his cell phone and thumbed his way through a phone directory search app. George looked for a distraction. He recognized Brett, his former classmate and brief T-ball teammate, standing in a corner and drilling himself on some sort of recitation. He walked over. "Weakest point?" Brett was saying, looking down to consult his business portfolio. "My weakest point is I'm a perfectionist, which is actually a real asset." George overheard J.D. behind him, flirting over the phone. "Sheila. J.D. Yeah, it has. All grown up. Well, why don't you teach me?" He tried to ignore the rest of the conversation. "I know it's a big workload," Brett was saying, trying to remain confident and calm under the increasing scrutiny of his imaginary interviewer. "I can handle it. I can handle it. I said I can handle it. Look, I was getting an ulcer. What would you do? I had an ulcer. What the fuck, motherfucker?" "Hey, Brett," George interrupted. Brett looked up from his notes. After a moment, recognition flashed across his face. "Oh, hey, George. Am I interrupting?" "Oh, no, I've got this all sewn up." George quietly nodded. Perhaps aware that George had seen his performance, Brett looked away, then down at his watch. "I wish she'd hurry it up. I've been here since 7:30. J.D. appeared next to George, pocketing his cell phone. "Let's go." From their blank looks, J.D. could see that George and Brett had no idea what he was talking about. "We're in," he told George. Hearing the door open, all three turned to face the Human Resources Manager's office. There emerged J.D.'s former debate team partner, Jim Adams. Urea-based fertilizer status quo is not a significant problem requiring regulation. It's not like people are going to smoke the stuff. Jim was walking out, clutching his overly polished black leather portfolio and sobbing. In the doorway behind him, Sheila appeared. She had always been tall, but because she was 2 years ahead of them, none had witnessed her gradual transformation into a stunning, power blouse-wearing professional. She leaned slightly to one side, bending one of her knees and creating two simultaneous impressions in George's mind. One, that she was busy, meaning that this stance would allow her to efficiently spring back from the doorway to resume her work, and two, that she was publicly making some sort of private communication to J.D., one that concerned supermodel legs. George would not have recognized her at all, but for her face-melting scowl. The horse teeth remained, but without braces they seemed to be in better proportion to the rest of her face. "Oh my God," he uttered under his breath. "J.D.," Sheila said in a shrill voice that resonated throughout the room. Heads turned as conversation quieted. Brett looked from Sheila back to George and J.D., and with a growing realization his look of confusion became a glare. "Come on," J.D. said, but George did not move. "Walk." J.D. shoved him forward. George, knowing that he would be pushed every step of the way if necessary, began to walk on his own. They crossed the waiting room, wading through a small sea of resentful faces. They reached Sheila, and George noticed that she was giving him a puzzled look. He could feel his stomach tightening. "You know George, right?" J.D. said, but even as Sheila shut the door and gave him a peck on the lips, she kept staring at George. "Sit down." She sat behind her gray steel-cased desk, something out of a county building fire sale, and indicated the cushionless swivel stools opposite. George and J.D. took their seats. J.D. placed his resume on the desk, and George did the same. His seat was missing a footrest and kept trying to return. He had to hold on to the front of the desk to remain facing forward. "Oh, please." Without glancing at J.D.'s resume, Sheila pushed it back to him. "I can get you an internship with Brewcorp. That's Brewmart's holding company. They're looking for engineering and accounting graduates. You'll be working on fire, electrical, HVAC systems for new retail spaces, some construction site visits, but mostly desk work with their development department at the headquarters building in Chippewa Falls." "That's the new polygon-shaped building, isn't it?" J.D. remarked. "It's a sextagon," Sheila corrected. J.D. grinned at the misnomer, but Sheila's expression admitted nothing. "J.D., that's what the shape is. It's a sextagon." "Of course it is," J.D. agreed. "It's $50 a week and they're looking to hire." Sheila placed an application packet in front of J.D. "You're the best." "That's right, baby boy." She picked up George's resume, eyebrows furrowing as she examined it. She said into the piece of paper, "They're not really looking for English teachers right now." George nodded and was about to thank her for her time when J.D. cut him off. "Oh, that's the wrong resume, bro. Tell her." George returned J.D.'s meaningful glance with a look of clueless confusion, and J.D. said to Sheila, "George majored in accounting, too." Sheila glanced up from the resume and looked George in the eye. "Double major?" "Double major," J.D. repeated. J.D. and Sheila both stared at George. He nodded his confirmation and returned the human resources manager's look with an anemic smile that did little to mask the pleading in his eyes. Sheila pointed decisively at him. "No." J.D. stood up. "Then I'm out too?" "Fine," Sheila said expressionlessly. J.D. inclined his head towards the door. "Looks pretty slow out there for engineers. Don't you get like a bonus for bringing in the smartest guy in the room?" "Are you the smartest guy in the room, J.D.?" Sheila asked, seemingly bored. "Sheila, don't even." "Yeah, I'm the smartest fucking guy in the room, and I've got another interview in an hour, so where have you got another interview?" J.D. just stared at her in silence. He turned to George. "Let's go." George stood as J.D. opened the door. Sheila looked from one to the other, then she told George, "I'll need you to fill out some paperwork." J.D. turned around. He made no wisecrack codifying his victory, but simply returned to his seat as she typed the short sentence into her computer. Obsolete workstation secured to the floor with a steel cable. She printed 2 copies, placing them in front of George, who had also sat back down. Forgetting to steady his chair, he slowly rotated a quarter turn clockwise as he studied the top document. It stated simply, "I, George Younger, have a tiny little dick." There was a blank signature line and a place for the date. "I don't," George stammered. He grabbed a hold of the desk and twisted himself around to face forward. I don't have a pen." J.D. handed his pen over. George held it over the agreement, pausing as a home buyer might do before signing a questionable mortgage. His seat completed another lazy quarter turn. He signed his name on both pages and reoriented the stool. Averting his eyes, he offered the papers back to Sheila. She only took one. "The other copy's for your records."